And our next question from webinar participant Margaret in Perth, Australia is, has there been any research on the psychology aspects of deliberative democracy? For example, the influence of group psychology.
Great. I believe it's pronounced, Margaret will probably agree with me, Perth. Group psychology, okay. Yes, absolutely. We care about groups and group psychology, and I'm going to give you two little, one sort of research note and then a process note. The research note is this. A lot of people are familiar with an experiment by Solomon Asch. It was actually a long series of experiments on conformity. And if you don't know about this, it's pretty straightforward. 12 people in a room. You're the last one of 12. The experimenter holds up a card with 3 lines on it. They're apparently different lengths, and the experimenter starts asking people one by one to say out loud which line is longest. And people keep saying it's line 2, line 2, line 2, and you're the last person, and line 2 sure does look shorter than line 3. And you're thinking, do I say it's line 3, or am I just an idiot? Is this one of this is probably some kind of optical illusion, right? And it's line 2, and I just don't So how many people say line 2? Well, it turns out that something like 20% actually said line 2, which is wrong. Line 3 is longer. Can't you see it? And that's the thing we all remember. And when we put together a process like this, we get nervous and we say, oh my God, Solomon Asch was right. We're going to conform. It's going to be crazy. But they forget, like, he was an experimentalist. You manipulate the variables. Here's a variable. What if one of those, and those 11 people are all actors, of course. What if one of those other people, one of those actors, says line 3? So you've got now 10 people said, oh, line 2 is longest. And one person said, I think it's line 3. And it comes to you. It's almost impossible to get you to say line 2. Because there is one other crazy person in the room, and you're whipped out, right? If you've ever heard the song Alice's Restaurant, right? 2 people, now you're comfortable. 3 people, and you have a movement, right? You're going to change these people. And that's why you don't want your groups to be too small, but all you need is just a little diversity. And, you know, some processes, like, actually, if I can go to Australia, the Australian Citizens Parliament was very careful. When they got together their 150 or so Australians, they said, you know what, we're doing a random sample, but we're going to make sure we have a representative number of Aboriginal Australians, even if it takes a little more work to find them. They've got to be in the room, and there's got to be more than one. I don't even care if statistically that group gets one representative. There's got to be more than one. So that during the break they can look at each other and go, wow, did your table say something incredibly racist? Yeah, they kind of did. You too? Yeah. Maybe we should say something about it, right? If you're there by yourself, you're kind of like, ooh, I don't want to be the jerk. You know? And who are you going to ask? So the funny consequence of this is sometimes when you're designing process, you don't want a perfectly random sample. Sometimes you want to not only stratify it, but you want to bump up some of the marginalized, underrepresented, or just fewer in number parts of the population, just so they've got a buddy there so they can survive the Solomon Asch test. The other thing I'll give you is a procedural innovation that I love that we did in Oregon is everything was hunky-dory for 4 days, and then on the 5th day, you have to break into the pro and con side on the ballot measure because they're going to write what they think are the best pro arguments for this measure, and another caucus is going to write what they think are the best con arguments. And that's the first time in the process they're not all at the table together, right? They break up. Well, wouldn't it be tragic if that's where it ended? Because they could just kind of drift off and start writing crazy stuff. And what if there's only 2 people who have one view? God knows what they're going to say, right? So what they did is they said those caucuses can write their own statements, but then they have to come back together as a full group and read them to each other and be accountable to each other. As it had turned out on Measure 73, the 24 people, remember this was an incredibly popular mandatory minimum, 21 of the people wound up recommending against supporting that. 21 out of 24 turned on something that was polling at 70 plus. And what about those 3 people, right? Well, they actually got a really important fact wrong by a magnitude of 10. And the other side said, when they read that, they said, ooh, I don't think that's right. You know, let's sit down, let's talk, let's look at that. They didn't control it. The 3 people could still put whatever they wanted in that little part of the statement, but they fixed it. The next week, it was a much more evenly divided split on medical marijuana, and both sides said things to the other side like, oh, I don't think that's, I think technically actually we need to change that word because that's a little misleading. Let me explain why. And the changes happened across the board in both cases. That's not always going to happen, but the point is the worst sort of distortions in group process happen when you're kind of isolated and you're seeing some things to try to not make people too isolated. Keep them together so that they can actually learn from each other through that process.
And a question from the audience? Yes.
You provided quite really interesting example more like I've been fortunate enough to be part of some programs we've done at the university. But the question that I have kind of concerns what happens outside and after the deliberative process. That is, I think it's pretty crucial in order for deliberative democracy to gain some momentum to kind of build up a culture that favors deliberative processes. And so I guess my question is more, how do you build that momentum and that social progression towards deliberation?
So the question is, how do you build the momentum in the deliberative democracy process, not necessarily within the process itself, but external to it?
You start with what you got. And you have to do kind of a cultural inventory to figure out what you've got. So the example of Mexico, for instance, is just going to have a different starting point. The reason I brought up Ned Crosby in the details there, I love that he started with the phrase citizens jury, because that was the hook in the U.S. That was what they got. Remember, people take the jury for granted, but once he put it in a metaphor, they were like, oh yeah, we do kind of know how to do that. And it kind of works. Yeah, I actually really like it. That was his connection. Now, it took 3 decades to kind of tool it into something that got institutionalized in a way he'd never expected it quite to be. And now he's actually doing citizen juries on political campaigns. He's done this once before where you're actually evaluating candidates through a citizen's jury. Now, will people get that? You're pretty far from the jury by now. Maybe they'll get it. Over time, I think these ideas do start to percolate through the culture. I don't mean to be too wonky on history, but when we think about how the jury came about, I think that gives us a little bit of a glimpse. People just do crazy things and cause change. In England, there was a Quaker who'd been preaching out in the square, and that was a crime. Quakers were like totally not cool in England at the time. And so they brought him in and said to the jury, all right, well, here's the trial, da-da-da-da-da. Now it's your turn to render a verdict, i.e. convict him, which is what the Crown, of course, expects. The judge is very clear about this. The jury goes off, deliberates, comes back and says, we're hung. And the judge is like, are you kidding me? Go back upstairs. The jury comes back down and says, it's getting late, we can't quite reach agreement. The judge says, okay, that's cool, no problem, I'm going to lock you in. See you tomorrow morning. They come back, the next day, and now they're kind of peevish. And they say to the judge, the jury finds that he was in the square and was like doing talking and stuff. What's your verdict? Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have one. The judge says, all right, and these guys are causing trouble, right? These are, Occupy, Court of England, right? And the judge says, okay, that's cool. I'm just going to put you in debtor's prison. Not for an indeterminate period of time. You just have to pay off your debt, which is, roughly $1 million or $2 in modern currency. See ya. So off they go to prison. Well, this kind of thing happens in England all the time, right? You're in prison and there's no reason or rhyme to it, and there you are and you're stuck. Have a good rest of your life. Such as it is, probably short and kind of brutal. But one of the people in prison has this crazy idea. And you've got to think how crazy this is. Who put them there? The judge, right? So the guy says, I'd actually like to sue the court. Who are you going to sue to? The court? Yeah. And the higher court finally says, hey, you know what? This whole jury thing, we kind of built it so that we weren't on the hook for all these decisions. Because if you trace it back a few centuries, it was like the Norman conquerors saying, oh my gosh, somebody's wound is infected, so you clearly stole the cattle. And everybody's like, he stole the cattle? He was in like a different county. And they're like, oh, that's what the hand says. And the Norman conquerors were like, this isn't going to fly. We're going to have a bunch of you people come together and say who did what, and it's your fault if you don't like the verdict, right? That eventually kind of grows into a jury. And the judges in the highest court said, yeah, I think that's kind of the point, that you people are on the hook for whether or not this person committed a crime. So, yeah, you know what? The judge is wrong. The jury can come out of debtor prison, and we've just established that juries have independence. Now, was the cultural situation ripe for that? Doesn't really seem like it. It seems like kind of, if I don't know what a Hail Mary pass would be in Canadian football, maybe you're on the 1 yard line because you got 25 yards of end zone. So you just bomb it to the back corner and you give it, to some chunky guy who's supposed to be blocking and he's like, I'm open. And you throw kind of a wobbling duck and he catches it and you're like, see, told you, time was ripe for that touchdown. You just work with what you got, and sometimes you don't got a lot, but you got to try. It's a sports metaphor. Roll with it.